In this video, I'd like to describe the evolution of the vertebrae, vertebral column, and thorax. Obviously, the vertebrates are named for a vertebral column, and then therefore it would be easy to assume that all of the vertebrates have something that looks like this. This is a depiction of a human vertebra. It has a hole for the spinal cord. It has processes for muscle attachments. It has this big body to help, bear the body's weight. There are joints between vertebrae. And so it's easy to assume that that is what we mean when we say that vertebrates have vertebrae. That's not true, however. A complex vertebra such as this, it actually took hundreds of millions of years to evolve. The vertebral column started off very simply and took, once again, hundreds of millions of years to evolve. So this is just going to depict that process and then also talk about some of the important modifications of vertebrae in different groups of vertebrates. Before there were vertebrae, there was what is called the notochord. Humans belong to the phylum Chordata. Vertebrates are the subphylum Vertebrata within the phylum Chordata. And the notochord was significant because it allowed an S-shaped movement. So when you think of a leech can constrict and expand its body. We can't, all right? When I do this, my back is still about the same length it was when I started. But because I have this rigid rod going down my back, the vertebral column, when muscles pull on it, it allows me to do this, which for the fish, which once again, for a couple 100 million years, the only vertebrates were fish, and that allows for the type of swimming that they do. So a stiff rod down the back then allows this S-shaped pattern of movement. Before there was a vertebral column, however, there was a notochord. So there are chordates alive today and chordates of the fossil record that have a notochord but no vertebral column. Hagfish are fish, and there's been debate on whether we call them vertebrates or not, but they have a notochord. They don't have any true vertebrae. Here you can see a lamprey. It is considered a vertebrate, and I'll get into that in a second. But notice that its vertebrae, its vertebral column, is not its main axial support. Instead, it has this notochord. So the notochord was the first support rod in the chordates. It was the major support rod of the early vertebrates, and the vertebral column then developed around it. Now, hagfish are fish, and there's been some disagreement about where they fit in the family tree, whether they're more primitive to lampreys or a sister group to lampreys. And in general, this is a significant point, that here you see cartilage rods in a hagfish, but notice that it is only in the tail. So this is a tail support. There are no neural arches. There are no pieces of cartilage which run down the back of the hagfish, which would qualify as vertebrae. I'm sorry. I actually did read a paper which said that there were little tiny pieces of cartilage representing either pluricentra or intercentra, and I'd like to investigate that further. But in general, if you were to ask where are the vertebrae in hagfish, you don't really see them. In a lamprey, however, notice that once again, the notochord is the support rod. All right, so when lampreys swim, they are using their notochord. However, look at that, and look at that, and look at that, and look at that. There are these little tiny pieces of cartilage above the notochord. Now, they are not vertebrae in the modern sense. I have a big, solid, bony vertebra. The spinal cord goes through it. There's places for muscle attachment. This little piece of cartilage is not the same. But vertebrae had to start somewhere. If you're asking, to see a big, solid, bony vertebra the way you and I have vertebrae, you actually have to wait a couple 100 million years into vertebrate evolution before you get there. And so vertebrae didn't start in the form that we now think of them. They had to start somewhere, and here's the somewhere, right? So that's what vertebrae looked like at the beginning, little pieces of cartilage over the notochord. Once again, the notochord was the support rod. Over time, the vertebrae would become more prominent and gradually replace the notochord. But this is how the vertebrae, the vertebrates then began. If we then go forward in time to the early jawed vertebrates, of which we have sharks alive today, notice that their vertebrae were far more extensive. In the fossil record, they still had a notochord, but they had little pieces of cartilage above and below it. In modern sharks, what we see is that the vertebrae has, the cartilage has consolidated and it completely surrounds the notochord. So sharks still have a notochord. It was much more prominent in the primitive early sharks, but now there is the cartilage have fused around it. So what is their axial support? Well, it's a vertebral column, but they still have a continuous notochord. If we were to look at the lampreys, all we see are these little pieces of cartilage over a notochord, and the early sharks look like that as well. As we look at later sharks and the primitive bony fish, what we see is, once again, the notochord is the support rod, but now we have little pieces of cartilage above it and below it. In the bony fish, this could then be converted to bone. Once again, post-cranially, in humans, but in also these vertebrates, everything starts off as cartilage, but it then can get converted to bone and what's known as endochondral ossification. And so what was a little piece of cartilage were later converted to bone. But once again, the notochord was the primary rod, and the vertebrae gradually surrounded it. By the time we're getting to the ancestors of amphibians, what we see is that the notochord still runs continuously, but the upper and lower pieces of the vertebrae contact each other in these bony fish. I'm sorry, here's going back to the sharks. You can see how the vertebral column does constrict the notochord, but the notochord does run continuously through the typical shark vertebral column. So the vertebrae started off as these little pieces above the notochord and then below the notochord, and then over time they expanded and contacted each other. So you can see neural arches, which form the spinous processes, which you can feel when you go down the midline of your back. They formed above the notochord, and then these little pieces known as pleurocentra that we keep, we amniotes, that is the major bottom part of our vertebrae. And then these intercentra. Now the intercentra, they would be significant in some of the amphibians. So whereas the amniotes will keep the blue, no, I'm sorry, I forgot my colors. The amniotes keep the red intercentra and lose, my fault. The amniotes keep the red pleurocentra, but lose the intercentra. Some amphibians, they reverse that. And so here, by the time we get to the bony fish now, these elements not only have become bone, but they've fused together. And now the notochord is no longer a continuous rod. So that's the case in most bony fish alive today, although I've read that some of the more primitive ones I've never been able to dissect still have a continuous notochord. That, however, happened later in the bony fish. When the first amphibians evolved, the notochord still ran through the middle. So when we look at the first amphibians like Ichthyostega here, it still had a continuous notochord. That's one of its primitive features. The bony elements of the vertebrae were forming around it, but they still allowed the notochord to run through it. Later tetrapods would then remove the notochord. Actually, in the very first tetrapods that actually still went into the brain, or went into the skull. The notochord, progressed that far. But here we have an early amphibian, and once again, the notochord was continuous throughout, and the vertebrae were just pieces around it. But that would change as the vertebrae became larger and then began to squeeze out the notochord, as you'll see in the next video. So I'll do this in the next video. And this is not only of interest in when we talk about fossils, but also as we talk about human development. So when you were an embryo, this is what your vertebrae looked like. You had a notochord that ran from head to tail, a continuous rod. And vertebrae formed as little pieces of cartilage around the notochord. These pieces of cartilage gradually got bigger, contacted each other, and squeezed out the notochord. So the same process which we saw happening in vertebrates over a couple 100 million years, we see to some degree mirrored in our own fetal development. Now, even though the body of the vertebra squeezes out the notochord, there still is a little piece left in what is called the intervertebral disc, which is fiber cartilage, but it has a pulp, which is the remnant of the notochord. If you ever have a herniated disc, this pulp is now bulging out, and that can be a problem. It can put a pressure on, say, a nerve. But in those intervertebral discs, we still have remnants of the notochord, but it is no longer a continuous rod. So once again, as we look at the vertebrates, they don't start out with vertebrae, not in the sense that we know. They start off with a notochord, but they get pieces of cartilage above the notochord. Then later there's pieces of cartilage below the notochord. And then slowly the cartilage becomes larger, surrounds the notochord, which is still a continuous rod. The vertebrae touch each other. Now, this is less important in fish, all of this, it happened very gradually. But once fish try to come out on land, supporting the weight of the body against gravity on land is far more difficult than supporting the weight in water. So the joints between the vertebrae are more important at that point in the fusion of these elements as well. Once again, you'll notice that in our lineage, the blue segments, they eventually disappeared, although this would happen in the amniotes. Thus, vertebrae are what are called composite bones. They form from multiple separate structures. If we were to look at the notochord and spinal cord kind of head on, a transverse section, what would have happened is that these neural arches would have formed above the notochord, pleurocentra and intercentra would have formed beneath the notochord, and then over time those cartilage pieces got bigger until they actually contacted each other. But in the early sharks, in the early bony fish, even in the early amphibians, the notochord was still a continuous rod. The vertebrae had just formed around it. It was only then later that the notochord was constricted and that all of these elements fused together and became bone. So that is the history of, essentially where vertebrae come from. Now, each group would then make modifications of it. So, for example, in tetrapods, one of the things that would happen is that there would be ligaments which would attach these vertebrae near the hip to the hip. So the very first amphibians like Acanthostega did not have that. So Acanthostega has no sacrum, but the sacrum is the specialized vertebrae which attached to the hip and allowed the legs to support the body's weight on land. So the first amphibians couldn't do it and probably spent their lives mostly in the water. But then as time goes on, there were ligaments and then there were bony attachments so that the vertebrae of the sacrum became specialized in order to support the weight on land. So tetrapods, that was one of the advances which had occurred in them. Okay, I guess I'm I'm sorry, I'm not repeating them. So once again, here, Ichthyostega was the first amphibian to have some semblance of a sacrum. The sacrum would vary. So even when we look at dinosaurs, they vary with the number of sacral vertebrae that they have, starting off with a small number, but then other groups would then increase the number of sacral vertebrae, making it stronger over time. So here is the human sacrum. It's a big solid bone, but it was made of separate vertebrae. So as a fetus, we had separate vertebrae, which then fused to become the sacrum. Interestingly, at least I find this interesting, why does the sacrum has its name? Well, it was called the sacred bone. Why on earth is this called the sacred bone? Well, I don't think we really know. Maybe because it's close to reproductive organs. Reproduction wasn't understood well in centuries past, and so maybe it was thought to be somehow mystical in that sense. There is another idea that for those who believe that after death, our bodies would be reconstituted and look exactly as they are now, you would need to have some piece of yourself that would not decay. And the sacrum, being a dense, compact bone, would be one of the last ones to decay. And so perhaps it was believed that from the sacrum, our bodies in the afterlife would be reconstituted. But for whatever reason, this is known as the sacred bone. Once again, it's a solid bone, but it's made of separate vertebrae which fuse. And it's extremely important because, as you can see, the only reason I stand upright and my legs hold the rest of my body up is because my legs attach to the hip, and the hip then attaches to the sacrum. So here's a joint, the sacroiliac joint, which we see connecting the sacrum and the sacrum and the hip. So this allows legs to support the weight of the body on land. Obviously extremely important as we support our weight on land. Fish don't have a sacrum. There's no specialized area where vertebrae attach to the pelvic girdle and the pelvic fin in fish. The very first amphibian, Acanthostega, didn't have any specialized sacrum, so it would not have been able to support its weight on land, showing that, once again, it's a primitive amphibian, a transitional feature lacking some of the characters it would have had later. Ichthyostega did have the first signs. So here, for example, you can see in a frog, there is vertebrae which attach to the hip, allowing the legs to support the body weight in jumping. So there are sacral vertebrae. As I had mentioned, sacra have varied over time. There's not just one way to have a sacrum. So if you look at the first dinosaurs, there were two vertebrae in the sacral region, which were specialized to attach to the hip and support the body weight. But as dinosaurs got bigger and got better at being bipedal, more were added. And so as you look in different lineages of dinosaurs, so this being a meat-eating theropod, this being a prosauropod, this being an ornithischian dinosaur, different vertebrae were then included in the sacrum to better adapt the sacral region for bearing weight on land. One of the significant things in birds is, because, birds, once again, being bipedal, they support the weight of their body with their legs. We see what's called a synsacrum. We see this all over the avian skeleton, that lots of bones fuse together. So rather than have like lots of little bony elements, withstanding the forces of flight, they fuse together. And so we see a synsacrum, which fuses together the vertebrae and the hips. And so the number of vertebrae can vary in the synsacrum. Once again, it's this really big fused bone. Here you can see an emu. Notice all of the separate vertebrae, which are fused there. Mammals, as their legs got stronger, they were no longer sprawling. They also then made their sacrum stronger so that their legs could support their body on land. And then obviously the same was happening in humans as we better adapted our hips for bipedal locomotion. Okay, so the sacrum starts in the tetrapods, and it's an important part of the vertebral column. Another region that I'd like to focus on is the thorax and the ribs. And the axial skeleton is made of the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage and thorax, the ribs and the sternum. So I'll kind of mention the ribs here and there. Amphibians tend to have very short ribs. They're just little bony processes. But look what happens in the amniotes. These ribs get longer. The vertebral column in general becomes stronger and more consolidated, and thus better able to support the body's weight on land. If you remember, there were those parts underneath the notochord, the pleurocentra and the intercentra. The intercentra become reduced or absent. But once again, the significant thing is the ribs get longer and then contact a sternum here. And so that is incredibly important, because one of the things that limits amphibians is that they can't breathe all that well. Amphibians' lungs, they don't work very well. And one of the reasons is, they have to suck air in and out, like, you see the throats moving of amphibians as they're breathing. But if you have these long ribs which contact the sternum, then the muscles between the ribs, which are called intercostals, when they move the ribs, they change the volume of the thorax. So this is obviously part of a respiratory system lecture. But when I change the volume of my chest, if I open my mouth, all this air comes rushing in. I don't have to suck it in with my throat, because just by changing the volume of the thorax, that changes air pressure, and pressure will go in and out. So the ribs of amniotes was tied to their breathing. Amniotes breathe better than amphibians do. That allows them to get bigger, to become more active, to get bigger brains, because they can get more oxygen. Or you can't be active, you can't be warm-blooded, you can't have a big brain if you can't get oxygen in and out of your body very well. So the ribs of amniotes were longer. They contacted the sternum, and this then is critical in being able to breathe better. Now, mammals did a couple of things. So as reptiles became mammals, there were a couple of modifications of the vertebral column typical of mammals. One is, it's interesting, once again, the point is this took hundreds of millions of years. If you ask, how long between the very first cartilage pieces of vertebrae to the point where you could pick up this one solid bone, all right, and say, aha, here's a vertebra the way that, a human vertebra is. Hundreds of millions of years. And it wasn't even done by the early amniotes, because the first couple vertebrae, they had all of these pieces here, okay? So here's the first couple vertebrae. And the pieces had not yet reached their final form when the mammal lineage separated from the other reptiles. So one of the things that the mammals did is they actually kept the blue pleurocentra. All right, so while most of the blue pleurocentra left, they actually kept one, and the body of vertebra number 1. So this piece should be stuck here. This is its inner centra. It should be there, but it isn't. It ends up getting stuck to vertebra number 2. So once again, this should be a piece of vertebra number 1, but it ends up being stuck to vertebra number 2. And as a result, our vertebra number 2 has a piece that sticks up. It's called the dens on the vertebra, called the axis. And our first vertebra has a space that now allows it to rotate around this dens. So when we shake our heads no, what's happening is that the atlas, vertebra number 1, is rotating around the dens, that part that sticks up of vertebra number 2. Reptiles can't do that. So it was the mammal lineage which did those last couple of modifications and how those separate pieces fused together. So that was a special thing about the mammalian vertebral column. Here's another one. If you look at reptiles, they have ribs here. And actually, if you look here, I mean, even a cat vertebrae, look at how long those processes are. Those are like the little embryonic remnants of ribs that's stuck here. So I don't want to say that there are no ribs here. There's actually like the little tiny pieces of them. But ribs like this, mammals actually lose their lumbar ribs. So in a reptile, all of these vertebrae have ribs. So there's no distinction between a thorax and a lumbar section of the spinal cord because they all look the same. Whereas mammals, they lose their lumbar ribs. So they only have ribs on thoracic vertebrae. Why would mammals do that? Well, because mammals now get beer guts. Their guts can hang out. Why would they want that? Well, when your guts hang out, your lungs get longer. So mammals actually can bring in more oxygen in each breath than a reptile can, because in reptiles, all the guts are held in. But in a mammal, if I inflate my lungs really big, that can push down on, and the diaphragm is what's helping to enlarge this. The diaphragm then pushes down on the guts, which hang out, but the lungs get longer. So when you see this, that mammals lost their lumbar ribs, it's because mammals need more oxygen to be warm-blooded, to be more active, to have bigger brains. And so therefore they needed a way to bring in more oxygen per breath than a reptile would. So that's a major change in the mammalian vertebral column, which then lets them be warm-blooded and smart and fast. Also other changes. When you look at salamanders and even reptiles to a degree, their arms and legs are not very muscular. Why not? Well, because that's not how they walk. All right, so a reptile, and certainly like something like a salamander, they're not propelling themselves with their arms and their legs. Instead, the arm is like what's called a hold fast. It just kind of anchors a point, and then it's the back. So it's the back muscles doing that S-shaped wriggle. That's what's propelling it forward. This is just a place to push off from, a pace to push off from. All right, so with reptiles and amphibians, you see like lizards, they're moving, with that S-shaped wriggle, even when on land. It's the back which is primarily propelling them, not the arms and the legs. Mammals decided to change that. I mean, look at a horse, look at a dog, look at you. All right, how do you move? It's not your back, it's your legs. On four-footed animals, it's their arms. When horses gallop, it's not the back muscles which is pushing that. So mammals started to make that change where the back now allowed less and less lateral undulation, and then and at the same time, the limbs and the limb muscles were getting more significant. Mammals would add additional sacral vertebrae, because once again, if the legs are then supporting the weight on land, then the sacrum needs to be stronger. Okay, the tail is reduced, and as we'll see when we talk about apes, the tail can get reduced more in certain groups than others. So once again, the mammals still weren't done the vertebral column, at the time of the amnios. So there's a number of changes which make the mammalian vertebral column different. And once again, just going back to whether it's the early tetrapods or the synapse of reptiles, the ancestors of mammals, we can see these changes slowly evolving. So here's a mammal-like reptile, but see the ribs? See the lumbar ribs here? And so therapsids were probably warm-blooded, to a degree, but they were still primitive in many features. They still had cervical ribs in the neck. They still had lumbar ribs and a long reptilian tail. And so, it took around 100 million years for the pelycosaurs to become the thoraxes, to become the cyanodonts, to become the mammals. And one of the, anatomical features which was changing was the vertebral column. Thorapsids, which were dominant at the end of the Permian period, evolved into the Permian cyanodonts by the very end, which survived the end Permian extinction and became the Triassic cyanodonts. And when we look at the Triassic cyanodonts, look at this, the lumbar ribs are gone. That means that this adaptation for being warm-blooded, which we associate with mammals, actually evolved in these mammal-like reptiles before mammals. So cyanodonts evolved into mammals by the late Triassic, but here by the mid-Triassic, we see that they probably have a diaphragm muscle, which allows them to breathe better and push down on this area without the lumbar ribs, okay? They still have ribs in their neck. That's still a primitive feature, which will persist even into the early mammals. So last, just a point, this, I don't want to give a lecture on the respiratory system, but how do we bring air into our lungs? Well, we change the volume of the thorax. And we do that because we have intercostal muscles between the ribs, which are contracting to help change the volume. And remember, amphibians don't have those. They typically have these little puny ribs, but it was the reptiles that had these long ribs attached to a sternum. Mammals got even better because they added a diaphragm. When the diaphragm muscle pushes down, the lungs get longer, but the guts hang out. The only reason the guts hang out is because there's no ribs in the lumbar region of the vertebral column. So here you can see the, once again, part of a respiratory system lecture, but changes in the vertebral column, very important in that. Now, I think I've hit some of the major thoughts, but there are little asides that we could do because, as you saw, vertebrae have continued to change. They didn't stop changing when we got to mammals. So let me just run through a couple of lineages. Some of the reptiles of the Triassic period adapted to life in the water. Now, at first, all right, if we look at here's an ankylosaur in the Permian. How many neck vertebrae does it have? How many cervical vertebrae? About 10. That's not a big number. By the time you get to the Triassic, how many cervical number would there be in the sauropterygians? 18. All right, so one of the adaptations for marine life here has been an increase in the number of vertebrae. By the time you're getting to the nothosaurs, we're looking at 20 to 30 neck vertebrae. And then by the time you get to the plesiosaurs, you see a lot of variation. But some of them can have really lengthened necks with over 70 vertebrae in their necks. And so in the Mesozoic era, there was a great diversity of marine reptiles. And when we look at things like Elasmosaurus, one of its adaptations was changes to the vertebral count and going from, the ancestral maybe 10 neck vertebrae to now 70 and more. And that's not the only group which has done that. Although, before I talk about the sauropod dinosaurs, just a quick question. How did, say, some dinosaurs get to have longer necks? Well, let's consider snakes, for example. How is a snake's body so long and thin? Well, the answer is it's added lots of vertebrae. So alive today, I think there are some snakes which have about 100 vertebrae. That's a small number. The highest number in modern snakes is 300, but I think there was a fossil snake that had around 500. So here, the snake solution is to add more vertebrae, just like that plesiosaur. You add more vertebrae to make a longer neck. So snakes have done that. Plesiosaurs have done that. There is another way, however. So when we look at a giraffe, all right, how do giraffes have long necks? How many vertebrae are in a giraffe's neck? 7, just like you and me. I have 7 cervical vertebrae. A giraffe has 7 cervical vertebrae. It's just that the vertebrae in a giraffe are much bigger and longer. So there are 2 ways to make your neck longer or lengthen the vertebral column. One is to add more vertebrae. Snakes have done that. Plesiosaurs have done that. But a second way is to make the existing vertebrae longer. So when we look at the sauropod dinosaurs, how did they increase the length of their vertebrae? Well, it was both, all right? So there are more neck vertebrae in part. Some of the thoracic vertebrae actually get so long that they extend into the neck. But for the most part, it's the lengthening of the vertebrae, all right? So, a little snake can have 200 vertebrae, here, this huge sauropod dinosaur, where the neck is lasting is half the length of the body, really only 19 vertebrae in the neck. So the sauropods could do both, especially in the tail, there could be additions of vertebrae, and 19 is a little bit bigger than the first dinosaurs, but primarily this neck length arose from lengthening the vertebrae, which were already there. Okay. One of the really significant things in our lineage is the loss of the tail. All right, so if we consider a monkey, monkeys have these long tails with lots of vertebrae. Actually, some of their tails can be prehensile. They can actually grab things with their tails. But when we ask how do monkeys run, monkeys, they are running on all fours in large part then because their urinary and reproductive organs, like the bladder, etc., are supported by these pubic bones. So if you're going to run around on all fours, what's supporting the pelvic organs against gravity? Bones. All right, so obviously that is a nice way to support the weight of the body. If a monkey were to try, so here's a monkey, and notice it is on all fours here, and the pubic bones are then underneath the pelvic organs. If this monkey were to stand upright, there's a hole there, and there would be no support. All right, so monkeys keep their tails and run around on all fours. The apes, however, they wanted to start to be bipedal more, so they could hang. Orangutans spend a great deal of time hanging. That they could climb vertically, which if the bigger you are, and a lot of the apes get to be pretty big, that's more pull of gravity, or even to walk bipedally. Here you can watch these gibbons. Gibbons aren't bad at walking upright, not as good as us. So here's gorillas climbing a tree vertically. So here's a problem. Gravity is pulling down on the pelvic organs. How can apes support that? You need more than just your skin to support your pelvic organs against gravity. And the answer is that apes lost their external tail. All right, so see that's the little tailbone of humans, and there was a similar little tailbone of chimps where separate vertebrae have fused to form what's called the coccyx. Just as separate vertebrae fuse to form a sacrum, separate vertebrae fuse to form a coccyx. And now you have the muscles which used to wag the tail. All right, so you used to have, monkeys can move their tail, they can hang by their tail, grab things with their tail. Those muscles, which dogs used to wag their tails, which horses used to raise their anus to defecate, we have those muscles, but now they form a sling. They're not moving the tail anymore. They're forming a sling underneath the pelvic cavity. It's not just skin that's supporting the pelvic organs. It's this pelvic diaphragm as well. So apes, this was the defining feature. When apes did this, they are now apes and no longer monkeys. And so the very first apes modified their vertebral column so that they lost the external that they lost their external tail. Um, so as I went up, there's a couple more sidelines here. Ribs have varied over time. Once again, they can be very short. They can have 2 attachments to a vertebra. All right. And actually, it's interesting. I'll get to this when we look at the cervical ribs of humans. We actually have a vertebral artery going through a hole in the vertebrae because we had ribs that looked like this that fused to the vertebra. So that an artery could fit between them. You can see here the ribs in amphibians are kind of short, whereas in the amnios, like this crocodile and like this snake, got to be much larger. With snakes, ribs are used in locomotion in a way that they're not in other vertebrates, so that the ribs can advance and retract, and that can help to pull a snake forward. There are different ways that snakes move. Yes, going side to side is part of it, but a snake can also climb up a straight line as its ribs kind of are involved in movement. Here you see that the sacral ribs help to form the sacrum there. And another structure which can happen when I talk about ribs. So what we think of is that our bony ribs attach to cartilage, which attaches to the breastbone, the sternum. But in some reptiles, there are also ribs going the other way as well, called gastrulea or belly ribs. And so we can have that. Also, one thought on the sternum is the sternum forms from different elements, but the number of vertebrae, the number of bony elements of the sternum can vary. We have 3, all right, but when you were to look at, say, a cat's sternum, it has more parts, more separate elements to it, right? All right, so there's more separate parts there. The reptiles had neck ribs, cervical ribs. That would be something that would be reduced in the mammals. But even if you were to look at, say, a duck-billed platypus, which is a mammal, it still has cervical ribs. So the ribs attached to neck vertebrae gradually got reduced over time. But we still have them. Now, we don't think of it. So when you hold up a neck vertebra, a cervical vertebra, you say, aha, here's a vertebra. Yes, but you actually had cervical ribs as a fetus, and then the cervical rib fused to the vertebra. And so you think of it as one bone, but once again, it's a composite bone. It's actually a vertebra with ribs attached. And in the hole created, we have the vertebral artery passing through. Once again, there are different lineages of vertebrates which have modified their ribs further. Turtles being significant because they developed a shell. What is in a turtle's shell? Well, there's dermal bone forming in the skin. There is epidermal scutes which form over the bones, but a significant part of the turtle shell is broadened ribs. So what we have is broadened ribs fusing to dermal bones in the skin, which then form this shell. And so when we look at fossil, turtles, we actually have examples where there are broad ribs, but not yet the dermal bones of the skull. So you can see the shells in transition. So once again, broad ribs form part of a turtle's shell. There were actually some diapsid reptiles which became gliding because they were able to lengthen some of their ribs. And so these there were a number of these in the fossil record, and a few alive today, whose lengthened ribs then allowed it a gliding membrane. So that was a a significant modification there. Birds, deserve a lot of attention when it comes to their arms, which became wings, and their legs, but their thorax is also significant. And when we look at how well birds fly, the first birds did not fly this well because they were missing some modifications of their thorax, so that actually within the group of birds, by the middle of the Cretaceous, there's actually another group called the ornithothoraces, the bird thorax group. And because some of these modifications then improved the ability to fly. So notice here there are ribs, but you see these other processes here, these uncinate processes then strengthen the thorax, because here you have a little bird with light bones, but as it's flying, that's an incredible amount of force which is being transmitted from the arms. And so these processes on the ribs, which you can see, that then just increase the ability of the thorax to absorb stress. Also here you see what I had mentioned before, those sternal ribs. So here's the sternum of the birds, the breastbone. Notice not only do you have ribs going down, but you also have ribs going up. A number of the dinosaurs had these as well. So there are sternal ribs. Now, instead of bony processes here, you can see on a crocodile that there's cartilage forming these uncinate processes for support, so that neighboring vertebrae can help each other. Okay, and so as we look at birds, they obviously evolved over long periods of time, starting from these theropod dinosaurs, and these modifications of the ribs, those processes, and certainly then this sternum, this then came later. Okay, look at the sternum here. So this is one of the things which would define the birds which were really good at flying. So if you think of Thanksgiving, or when you eat either turkey or chicken, there's all of this breast meat. Why? Well, because birds have a sternum which isn't flat like mine, but it comes out to here. So their chest muscles come out to here. That's why the chicken breast, the turkey breast is so big, because it's in here. Here's the sternum. I have a flat sternum, but this bird has a big keel on its sternum, which gives it these big flight muscles. And this was not present in the first birds. All right, this keel of the sternum, it came in later groups of birds as they got better at flying. So the early birds, they probably would have had to run to take off, or climb up a tree and jump and flap on their way down. But later birds with these huge chest muscles, they could just whoosh and take to the air, the way that most modern birds can do. Not all birds have a sternum like that. There are still flightless birds, and flightless birds have a flat sternum, just like I do. So the sternum has varied over time. So here you can see, a cat sternum, multiple pieces. Here's a human sternum with its three pieces: the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. But here you can see in the dinosaurs, many dinosaurs had those sternal ribs coming up from the sternum. All right, so not only so the meat-eating theropod dinosaurs could have these, and then we see them also in birds. And so once again, the thorax of birds is not to be underestimated, because actually there's a group of birds called the ornithothoraces, the bird thorax group, which had modified their thorax with those processes with the sternal ribs, the keeled sternum, they then became much better at flying than the much better at flying than the first birds had been. Also, there were other changes to the bird thorax, so they were better flyers than the first birds would have been. So the first, birds would, have been capable of flight, but powered flight the way that we think of it, probably would not have been that good. So birds make a number of changes. One, they make their tail shorter and lighter. That's less weight on that end of the body. They lose their teeth. That's less weight on that end of their body. They get this big keeled sternum, with all these flight muscles. And then, as I'll discuss later, they have this neat way where the muscles which pull the wings up are actually located underneath the wings because of this neat pulley system. That's a neat trick, which we'll get to later. All of these things change the center of gravity of the birds and made it better for flying. I mean, if birds had big teeth, that would, change their center of gravity, and they would not be good at flying. So birds don't grind their food with, teeth in the mouth. Instead, they're grinding it with the gizzard, which is now closer to the center of gravity. There you can see a gizzard in a chicken. And so the thorax of birds had to get modified for them to be the good flyers that they are today. And this occurred over time. All right, so just like our vertebrae did not appear in their final step, birds were not good flyers at first. So here we see, some of the first birds with their long tail, with their teeth, without the keeled sternum. They would not have been the flyers of today. They would not be better flyers for tens of millions of years in the future, and modifications of the thorax were important in that. All right, so here you can see what a huge chest muscle we have here. Here, and also one of the really neat things about birds is this is the muscle which actually pulls the wings up, but it's underneath the wings, and the way for that is that there's this like little lever system, but that once again allows the center of gravity to be more beneath the wings, which is easier for flying. And so once again, things in evolution occur slowly, and as we look at the evolution of birds, the very first birds were missing these modifications of the thorax, which occur here, which make them better flyers. So I think I just repeat that and focus on the sternum in this next video here. So once again, we have a flat sternum, and our chest muscles attach to it. All right, so here we clearly have chest muscles, and they can be powerful, but they're attaching to a flat sternum. And when you look at the sternum of birds, it's much larger and is this prominent what's called a keel. All right, in addition to these other processes, which then allow the chest muscles to become that much larger. So if you had a keel on your sternum, if you had a breastbone that came out to here and chest muscles from here to here, well, when you did this with your arms, things would happen. All right, so birds can take off, but they've got these huge chest muscles attached to this huge sternum, whereas our sternum, by comparison, is flat. And when I say, that's the case in most birds, certainly those that fly. There are some flightless birds alive today, like this rhea, which you're going to see here. So that's a rhea, and it has a flat sternum. So here's a skeleton of a rhea. It has a flat sternum. It doesn't need it doesn't need that the large flight muscles. So last point is obviously lots of lots of changes have occurred in the evolution of the thorax and the vertebral column. One other thing that I mentioned is that some reptiles and some dinosaurs lengthened the spines of their vertebrae to make sails. There were low sails, there were significant sails, and this could have, done a number of, accomplished a number of goals. But one of the things that we think is it would have helped them regulate their temperature, because if you have a sail like that, that's more skin, and when the sun hits you, you will warm up faster. If the wind is blowing, you can cool down faster when it's hot. So there were sauropod dinosaurs which had sails, like a Margosaurus there. There were ornithopod dinosaurs which had sails, like Ouranosaurus and some of the iguanodonts. There were mammal-like reptiles like Dimetrodon, which had sails. And once again, we think that this then, one of the things that it did was to help them regulate their body's temperature. So this has been a review of the vertebral column and thorax of vertebrates and some of the significant modifications in different lineages.